So we're very excited to be hosting this conversation on spectrum sharing. I wanted to quickly just do a quick note about TIA. TIA is the Trusted Industry Association for the Connected World. We represent over 400 leading manufacturers and suppliers of telecommunications equipment for the networks across the globe, and we have been around in one form or another for almost 80 years. We're very excited to be hosting this panel today of industry and US thought leaders, and I'm going to introduce our panelists now, who will have time for brief remarks before we go into a moderated panel. First, we have Peter Tenhula, the Deputy Associate Administrator from the Office of Spectrum Management at NTIA. Then we'll have Kimberly Baum, the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar, followed by Mary Brown, the Director of Government Affairs at Cisco, and then finally Jennifer Warren, the Vice President of Technology, Policy, and Regulation at Lockheed Martin. So first, Peter, would you kick it off for us?
I sure will. It's good to kick off the race to 5G. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for TIA and the forum for inviting me to participate. Again, I can't remember the last time I did this, but it's great. I'm going to mark the my starting time so I don't go over time. But I want to just give you a couple perspectives about spectrum sharing. I've been involved in this game almost 30 years or so, but I was trained as a lawyer, so I want to get my explicit and implicit biases right there out on the table. Us lawyers tend to focus on legal rights associated with sharing and spectrum. We also tend to look at the regulatory obligations that the parties have or they think they have in these and try to avoid disputes involving those obligations. I'm with NTIA, that currently stands for National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Derek was on the previous panel. Derek Clopin talked about the multiple hats that we wear at NTIA. I'm in the Office of Spectrum Management, where we're responsible for managing the federal agency use of spectrum. So I tell my relatives, we're the FCC for the federal agencies, the Department of Defense, the Federal Aviation Administration, Department of Homeland Security, all those other users of spectrum beyond the cellular providers that everybody always tends to think of. Another role we have is the advisor to the White House on all telecommunications and information policy. We represent the executive branch before the FCC. So whenever the executive branch needs to express its views at the FCC in a proceeding, we do the filings. Other parts of NTIA are involved in broadband build out and access, policies involving cybersecurity, supply chain management, privacy, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a broad portfolio for a very small agency within the Department of Commerce. Another role I have is the chair of the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, also known as the IRAC. It's been around since 1922. The longest serving and continuously serving Interagency Advisory Committee. A lot of our work involves coordinating the FCC proceedings that involves spectrum management, including those that impact federal use, which is pretty much every FCC proceeding these days, at least spectrum proceeding. We have several subcommittees that do kind of the day-to-day work within the IRAC, involving frequency assignments among the federal users and also coordinating non-federal assignments and licensing requests that come through the FCC. We certify spectrum systems for spectrum supportability to make sure that there's an adequate spectrum for new systems that come, and there's a whole diverse set of federal systems that use the band and a lot of sharing going on. We put our regulations, I mentioned the regulatory obligations, we codify those in, it's called the NTIA manual or Red Book. That's been around since 1965 and is huge, thick volume. Some people think it makes a better doorstop than anything else, but we're working on modernizing that. Spent a few years at the private sector, where I got my MBA in the College of Hard Knocks, but learned a lot about spectrum sharing from that perspective as well. and also spent about 15 years at the FCC. But I think the most important perspective I want to try to bring into this discussion is historical. Some call me an amateur historian, or some actually, most call me amateurish when it comes to the history that I love to delve into. But spectrum sharing actually has been around for quite a while. You go back to the first radio, the legislation, the 1912 Radio Act, you'll find time-based sharing where the first 15 minutes were reserved for government use, or unless there's a ship at sea that's in trouble. That you can find the language. It's still in the current Communications Act in Section 323. It provides this time division approach to sharing spectrum. The first 15 minutes is government. The rest is for non-government. And that was carried on to the 1927 Act, where this dual institutional structure between NTIA and FCC was set up. It was not NTA. NTA didn't exist until 1978, but the president was the one that had the authority to regulate the federal use of spectrum. And it was the president and the FCC who dealt with the coordination up until the 50s, when the first advisor to the president was established. The other perspective, and this was carried on to the 1934, another historical perspective is kind of seeing how sharing got more and more dynamic. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. They had dynamic frequency selection in 5 gigahertz, but you go back even further in the high frequency bands, HF, they call it automatic link establishment. I think that goes back to, I think, the 40s. Decentralized trunking in land mobile radio. I mean, early satellite protocols, sharing protocols, I recall one called Aloha, involved the sharing of the satellite spectrum. So my time's almost up, but I just want to talk, and we'll get into the more recent sharing examples and how it's getting more and more dynamic. And again, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That was certainly interesting, and thank you, Colin, for having me here. This is a great group of panelists. And thinking about the race to 5G, I would like to stress that satellite networks will be an important part of the 5G ecosystem. You know, it's the satellite networks with their broad coverage that will ensure connectivity everywhere and to everyone. Satellites broaden 5G service delivery and connectivity to unserved and underserved areas, extend and complement cellular networks, and provide high resiliency against natural or other types of unexpected events. You know, and standardization activities are ongoing today in 3GPP to advance satellite integration in 5G. Satellite networks are being addressed in the normative phase for non-terrestrial networks in Release 17 that 3GPP is currently working on. And in addition, you know, I think it's worth noting that hybrid satellite and terrestrial networks are already being implemented today to bring the benefits of both technologies, high capacity, high speed, and low latency to customers. So as such, to win the 5G race, you know, I believe it's important that we maintain a spectrum environment where multiple types of networks and technologies have access to adequate spectrum. It's a mistake to focus solely on spectrum for terrestrial 5G without ensuring other technologies that are part of the 5G ecosystem, like satellite, also have access to adequate spectrum under reasonable frameworks where they can also grow and expand. Thinking more about satellite systems, they continue to require access to blanket license spectrum, spectrum where a satellite system can deploy a user earth station at any time without having to do further coordination. An example of such a band would be 29.5 to 30 gigahertz. In addition, to support the increasing desire for higher data rates from consumers and other customers, satellites also need access to large amounts of gateway earth station spectrum. That spectrum can be shared, but still, these gateway earth stations need meaningful access to spectrum at an adequate number of sites to support competition among multiple satellite operators and in locations where there is access to fiber that you need for connectivity, access roads, et cetera. So when you consider the strengths of different technologies, I believe there are ways to meaningfully accommodate multiple services as long as we in the regulatory community place adequate importance on accommodating multiple technologies. It doesn't have to be one winner, and a single winner won't allow the US to take full advantage of 5G's network of networks. And thank you, Colin, for allowing me to make that introduction.
Hi, I'm Mary Brown from Cisco Systems. And Colin, thank you for having me today. And I found the introductory comments by Peter and Kimberly to be very apropos of the conversation today about sharing. So Cisco Systems is famously known for having invented routers and in the ensuing decades have expanded our range of IP-based technology solutions to address a range of customers from various kinds of service providers to enterprises. We have also preached repeatedly through the years that many things are contributing to a rise in demand for use of networks, whether it's on the federal side or whether it's on the commercial side. So devices are becoming more competent and using more data, enabling more throughput. Networks themselves are increasing, broadband networks of all types across a range of technologies, including the satellite ones that Kimberly talked about, getting more powerful. The underlying technologies are changing. We are using wireless data more and more, and so we continue to see traffic building in the US and around the world. Again, for every kind of user that is happening. And so here we are at the crossroads of how do we use the radio spectrum we have to enable everybody to get what they need, to enable government missions to be achieved, to enable commercial users to use spectrum the way they want. I will say, particularly on the for enterprises, whether they're public enterprises or private sector enterprises, I think it's often not appreciated enough how those networks need wireless connectivity. Their data is going wireless. It's not just those of us out here with our cell phones and our iPads and whatnot using wireless data. But it is the way in which U.S. businesses actually produce output now, and that is a trend that started some years ago, and it's just accelerating. So, with respect to how do we use this resource of our radio spectrum, it's very obvious that we're moving into a mode where we're going to have to share more and more. We've been in that mode for a while. And when I think about sharing, what I think of is this is a big umbrella term that now means a lot of things. And we've had a lot of development of sharing technology. So we have a lot of tools in the toolkit and some new ones that are sort of beginning to be identified for the future. So just a quick review of all the ways in which sharing can take place. Peter mentioned time-based sharing was originally part of the Communications Act, and that's a fascinating note to history. But probably a more prevalent form of sharing historically has been sort of geographic-based sharing. Keep the transmitters and receivers away from each other. And when we look at the FCC rules, they are replete with those kinds of geographic keep away kind of provisions that historically have been used so that different kinds of systems can be in the same band, just geographically separate them. We also have a number of examples of underlays where we have one technology using a band of spectrum and a different technology using the same band. the C-band uplink spectrum in 6 gigahertz, right? There's satellites using that to go from Earth to the satellite. There are also a lot of terrestrial uses, fixed services uses there. There's the example of ultra-wideband underlay, a very low power wideband underlay that we've used. Similarly, the 6 gigahertz low power indoor unlicensed devices are intended as an underlay. We've now migrated to automated keep away kind of devices, and I would say TV white spaces is an example of that. Let's keep the unlicensed uses away from television, but we do it in an automated fashion to make sure that devices are staying away from broadcast reception. We also have the example of the 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordination technology, which is not yet quite in being, but is on its way, where we're going to keep unlicensed devices away from fixed links, fixed microwave links. So we're automating that. We're trying to, but we're still in the keep away mode, but we're applying technology to keep transmitters away from each other. We also have sensing. Peter raised, in the 5 gigahertz range, unlicensed devices in some of those bands have to sense the presence of government radars and remove themselves from those channels if radars are present, called dynamic frequency selection. CBRS also uses sensing, environmental sensing, to detect when government radars are present, and they use that to inform the database. So we have sensing. We have hierarchy. Again, CBRS is an example of hierarchy. The generally authorized users can use spectrum that's not in use by the priority access licensees. And then as we move forward, we have a suggestion from NTIA recently about sharing, a sharing idea where the protected user would inform a database that there's certain spectrum that is out of bounds for a particular period of time or permanently. And this informing technology would then allow other users who have less rights than the priority user to use whatever spectrum is not available. And that's a pretty interesting idea, particularly for temporal use of spectrum by the government. And of course, way off, a little further off into the future, there's also conversations beginning around AI and whether or not we can develop intelligent engines that really help us use spectrum to the maximum without having a lot of manual intervention or set algorithms that are going to leave spectrum on the table. Can we figure out a way where the advanced intelligence can identify when spectrum is being used and when it's not being used, and allow radios to take advantage of fallow spectrum on a sort of moment by moment basis? Probably a little far off in the future. There's a lot of questions and a lot of issues to be resolved, but those conversations are starting. My hope is that as these sharing issues progress, we develop a better syntax for what we're talking about, because the word sharing now means so many things, and there's so many technologies and techniques we have either developed or are thinking about. It's helpful to know exactly what people mean when they say it. So thank you very much for the opportunity for these intro comments, and I'll pass it along to Jennifer.
Hello, and thank you very much, TIA, for including me on this. The beauty of going last is that so much of the meaningful conversation has already started with the comments that my fellow panelists made. But I want to pick up just real quickly on a point that Mary made about all the different types of sharing concepts that have already been tried. That is true. Many have been tried and are even in the midst of being tested out. The question is, how do we learn? What are the lessons we can learn from, whether it's the dynamic frequency selection at 5 gigahertz to some of the other sharing approaches that have been mentioned to come up with an approach that really addresses the ability for heterogeneous uses to not only find a way to share in their current generation, but also to continue to have that spectrum remain viable for next generations of the various technologies, be they commercial wireless, defense technologies, et cetera. So as Lockheed Martin, we've been engaged in spectrum sharing discussions of various flavors. As a technology provider in the aerospace and defense sector, we focus on spectrum through a space lens, from satellites to interplanetary communications. It may be a little ways away, but NASA's already thinking, right, about lunar comms, aviation, manned and unmanned, radars, as well as secure wireless and satellite communications. So we're pretty impacted and engaged in most of the discussions about how commercial uses can coexist, 5G and satellite services, commercial flight test and medical devices, but also then between federal and non-federal uses, such as the current FCC proceeding on wireless sharing with radars in the S-band. And so we've been on this learning curve collectively as industries, and we're hoping that the next generation of discussion of sharing actually does pick up the best of those ideas, but also looks a little bit more forward into enabling, again, next generation uses to be incorporated into those sharing regimes, because the static nature of some of these doesn't really allow for our various industries to continue to be technology providers globally. Thank you. I'll give it back to Colin.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your introductory comments, and thank you on behalf of TIA for just being part of this panel and having this discussion. And thank you, of course, to the America Spectrum Management Conference for hosting this platform. I know we've got some panelists with a hard stop at 1, so even though we started off late, I want to dive right into our questions. That our first one, I think a lot of you touched on in your initial speeches, which is, as the demand for spectrum resources continue to increase, there will of course be a greater reliance on spectrum sharing as opposed to just reallocation. What lessons can be learned from looking at existing frameworks such as CBRS or the 6-band gigahertz to facilitate faster resolution of agreements in the future, and how can industry and government work together to facilitate additional sharing? I'd like to start off with just a perspective from our industry panelists, and then ask Peter, of course, to give his own perspective on this. Mary, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. This is a great question because we've got to get faster. We've got to do more and faster. So I've been heavily involved in the 6 gigahertz proceeding at the FCC, looking at unlicensed use of a band that's already in use by C-band uplink and by fixed services microwave and mobile microwave uses. And one of the things we saw there is that we can use some of the sharing technologies and decisions that were made in CBRS to sort of jumpstart the sharing environment in the 6 gigahertz band, which is great. So we're kind of taking that technology and some of those decisions and iterating on them to try to speed up the sharing environment. And in particular, there are some technologies that we can pull directly from the database solutions that have been developed for CBRS, but there's also decisions around protocols and things like that about how do databases talk to devices. So as we move ahead into an environment where we can enable outdoor sharing of unlicensed devices with all these existing incumbents, and we're going to do that pursuant to a database approach. What we're finding is there's a lot that can be repurposed, and we can move faster, hopefully, than we did in the CBRS case, where literally that was being built from the ground up, and it took, I think, longer than anybody anticipated or wanted it to take, but perhaps it's understandable in that situation.
I was on mute. Thank you. It is 2020, guys. Kimberly, Jennifer, anything you want to add from the industry side before we move over to Peter on spectrum sharing?
Go ahead, Kimberly.
Okay, so I just had one, kind of, I guess, comment on the CBRS framework, and I know it's an older framework, as Mary indicates, but in that case, the FSS use of the band was frozen at a certain point in time. So that service didn't get to grow and continue to use the band. That piece of it, perhaps isn't that attractive for other frequency bands where, you have FSS use that's growing and expanding. And certainly maybe you wouldn't necessarily call it sharing if you're, freezing the use by one service. So that's one point I wanted to make.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important. That was what I was trying to get about allowing all the sharing technologies and services to be able to evolve. And that, to focus on the second part of your questions is what can industry and government do together? It's also what can industries do together? How can disparate industries with different needs and technologies come together to formulate the sharing concepts? And, we're kind of excited about a new working group that's been set up in the context of NDIA, sorry, not NTIA, but NDIA, where the wireless OEMs and some of the radar technology providers are getting together to talk about how do we design and look at these at the front end, not retrofit at the tail end. Kind of forward looking, and that hasn't really happened before, and that's an important part of the dialogue for a meaningful sharing environment in the future. And if the US can lead on that, that's a win-win for commercial wireless, defense technology providers, everybody in the spectrum ecosystem in the United States.
Well, Jennifer took about 3 of my points, so I'll just reflect back on she mentioned the evolution that's going on in the way that technology builds upon, or the policy builds upon prior policies. We went from DFS to TV white spaces to CBRS and to 6 gigahertz. All kind of building off each other as an example. For government industry collaboration is crucial to all of this. Give it a couple examples. In the past, the AWS-3 was very successful as a result of collaboration between government and industry under the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee umbrella. We have 2 very important members of that committee, advisory committee here. So I would put a plug in for the work of the CSMAC and Jennifer and Mary, especially. Coming up with the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band. In our letter to the FCC, we emphasized the need for industry to provide information about its 5G plans, so that the technical studies can be done. And also, we said we're going to convene workshops. We did that in the AWS-3 context. And it's about, so a lot goes on there's going to be the rulemaking phase and then the post rulemaking phase. And it seems like more and more is happening collaboratively after the rulemakings are done. We see that happening with the industry groups in 6 gigahertz. And that definitely happened in CBRS. It was, I think, very, very constructive and to come up with the SAS and the ESC approaches and that collaboration. And we used we got help from our lab out in Boulder as well. But I'll emphasize again the need to come in earlier now, like we are in 3450, to get these 5G parameters and work together to figure out what is the sharing construct that needs to be developed there.
That definitely makes sense. And thank you for, closing out that question. I also wanted to start with you for our next one, because as you said in your initial comments, NTIA does often act as kind of the FCC for the federal government. So one of the key responsibilities, of course, of NTIA is to work with the FCC and other agencies, determining what spectrum they can make available for commercial wireless needs, while also ensuring that agencies have their spectrum they need to perform critical federal missions. So how have the NTIA and the FCC been able to collaborate effectively in recent years, and how could further interagency coordination be improved? And then I guess after Peter's response, I'd like to also open it up. What role does industry play in this whole interagency coordination effort?
Yeah, well, I've been involved in this from multiple sides. You know, on the FCC side, when ultra wideband, the DFS was established, and the AWS-1. So I was at the FCC and I saw how it the collaboration worked very well in a couple other bands like 70, 80, 90 gigahertz as well. So and then now in the NTA side as chair of the IRAC, you know, that the FCC is a liaison member to the IRAC. Since that's been going on since the 50s. And we also have what's called a policy and plan steering group, which is kind of higher level policy where the FCC comes in as well with the other agencies, so they can hear directly from get the other agencies' perspectives in those fora. We have tons of informal ad hoc, you know, collaboration behind the scenes. You know, at the staff level, we're constantly in touch and working on all kinds of things. How can it be improved? Well, we're hearing we have a MOU right now that's been in place since the early 2000s, which was an update to the one from 1940. We got a working group that's led by Mary that's working on some, and I don't want to preempt her group's efforts there to potentially improve the kind of formalization of the coordination efforts that go there. But you know, I'm sure there's lots of room for improvement. In particular, there is a statutory requirement for the head of the chairman of the FCC and the head of NTA to get together twice a year to conduct spectrum planning. So it starts with the leadership, you know, and that's kind of all I really should say about that. So leadership is at the top is important, and making sure that those leaders collaborate is what I, you know, from my low level would be my number one improvement.
So
feel free to kick us off, Jennifer.
Well, I recall that I might be going next. So, you know, I think Peter referenced the recommendations that CSMAC may be making on improvements in the MOU, and certainly there are some tweaks there to update it to encourage just the observance of it, let alone the expansion of it, and to try and see it instantiated, because we all know that the signals from the top can very much impact attitude and engagement at career and more junior levels. So we think that's, you know, important as a general matter, and it's not just in the CSMAC that we're seeing conversations about the importance of that, but also other groups. But you know, while I guess most spectrum issues are there aren't that many disagreements. When the disagreements happen between NTIA and FCC, they are very visible. And usually they are very serious in terms of what, at least, you know, we hear the federal agencies bring as concerns. You know, will their weather forecasting skills be able to be maintained? And, you know, given the accuracy of what we just experienced with forecasting for all of the hurricanes and again, the precision of the accuracies, that's so important, right? So when we see these, what is the role of industry in trying to help resolve these? It's coming together to try and address solutions. And I think the important emphasis is there's not an industry, it's industries. And I think that often gets lost in the conversation about spectrum. If we're lucky, it's wireless and satellite. That's a good day. But most times, the rest of the industries that rely on spectrum are second to third to fourth level thought in terms of an awareness level every day. So I think, you know, leveraging all of the industries is an important part of this, and that requires outreach and just like in other areas, inclusion. And so that is, I think, a role in an area where FCC and NTIA could collaborate together, as opposed to in stovepipe fashions, to try and bring the best of industries together to talk about some of the really thorny and knotty issues that they have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. Kimberly, Mary, anything to add to that? I'm sure.
Well, I would just say, as a stakeholder, industry is far better served when the FCC and NTIA are closely collaborating together on issues. We're always better served by that. And that assumes that the federal agencies are themselves working through the NTIA to make their views known. I think the recent 3.4, 3.5 announcement from the federal government is testament to that. So I congratulate you, Peter, and your colleagues at DoD on that one. I would say one other thing. If you had asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, listen to your radio engineers more, right? Listen to the engineering more. But I'm now convinced, after watching a number of sharing conversations that seem to involve people talking past each other, I'm now convinced we can't assume that there's a generic knowledge of education in terms of the radio engineering community. People may know their system very, very well and have no idea what the other system is about. And so I don't know where this goes, Colin, but I see a need for some greater cross-pollination, education, some way to kind of put people on the same footing. I think that could only redound to the benefit of these sharing conversations so that people are not talking past each other. Thanks.
That's a great point.
Thank you. Kimberly, anything to add on to that?
Just to emphasize what other folks have said, just more collaboration across the different industries, and I think between the different parts of government can really help move this conversation forward, and maybe in different ways, not such a public debate, but where you can have real conversations and really share and learn together.
I think that's a really good point on the transparency issue. Now, I know I had 2 more questions. Shame on me for thinking we could get through 4 in this time. And I know 2 of our panelists have to drop off sharply at 1. But I did want to kind of mash together our last 2 questions I had planned, which was on, one of the cornerstones of creating efficient sharing agreements is the development of a national spectrum strategy, which, of course, NTIA is currently working on with the Spectrum Strategy Task Force. While we're still awaiting a strategy, Peter, if you could say, well, actually, sorry, I do want to give Jennifer and Kimberly first stab at this. What's the role of industry in your minds in working on this strategy? And also, we are on the precipice of an election, and regardless of what happens in November, what would, from your perspectives, would be the kind of top issues over the next 4 years that we should be focusing on in terms of spectrum?
So we're going to both be very quick. So spectrum has been a very bipartisan issue. I would expect that spectrum sharing would be a top-level focus for probably R&D, and hopefully, to Mary's point, to really have a differentiated understanding of the different technologies. I would never hire, one type of RF engineer to build another type of RF product. So, an aerospace engineer, maybe not a public safety wireless engineer, and vice versa, right? So there is rocket science alike. So bipartisan focus on spectrum sharing would be what I think would be the next administration or continuation, whoever wins.
Kimberly, any thoughts before we have to sign off?
So maybe, just certainly I agree with Jennifer, and, we would like to see, the U.S. move forward with some of the decisions made at the WARC, like implementing the 51.4 to 52.4 gigahertz allocation for FSS, and also, just being sure that there are meaningful opportunities for FSS to continue to grow. For example, in the Spectrum Frontiers bands, showing some flexibility in how Earth stations are accommodated. But thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much for being with us. Peter, do you have anything on the national spectrum strategy?
No, let's talk about Jennifer and Kim. This all started with a memorandum from President Trump, I guess it was November 2018, which called for a national spectrum strategy. NTIA put out a request for comment. We got some good comments on that. Drafted a strategy, and I think the Deputy Secretary Kelly announced at last year's symposium that we had transmitted that the strategy to the White House. So it's at the White House. It's being considered, and so I imagine it's either for the next term or the next president to figure out how to implement that. But we're this, like I mentioned, the CSMAC working group that's already dealing with some of the issues that we teed up in that strategy involving the institutional and coordination issues, the automation that's going on that was called for in the president's memo involving that. There's a provision in the two bills for the National Defense Authorization Act that's going to work towards developing a strategy centered around IT modernization and spectrum management, working with the key federal agencies and the FCC on that. So it's kind of, the strategy itself, the document itself, maybe have overcome by events anyway, and is one of these documents that may or may not, just sit on a shelf or an inbox somewhere. But it's the principles are well known. The priorities are well known. They're set forth in the president's memo, and we get memos have at least since Clinton about every few years, or used to be executive orders, but these memos. So we'll see what the next memo says.
Great. And Mary, for taking us home here, you can either respond to the national spectrum strategy, priorities of the next 4 years, or both.
Well, I'll just call out two things. One, I think it'd be great to have a strategy, because it'd be great to have a North Star that everyone could key off of. But as Peter said, I don't know that we need it, because we all know what the challenges are. We've got to do more with what we have in the radio spectrum, right? So, while it'd be great to have, and I hope whatever happens, whoever is elected president, we get that North Star. But we can, as a community, we know what we have to do. The second thing I would say is just to highlight Peter's IT modernization point. This is really important. If we don't have access, if the federal government does not have access on an automated basis to how it's using spectrum and all of the technical parameters around its use of spectrum, it becomes almost impossible to figure out how we are going to advance sharing going forward. And so not just requiring it, but funding it becomes a really important point. And sort of the same thing with the FCC. They have a lot of electronic databases. Those are going to need over time to continue to be upgraded and evolve in order to keep up with the demands of these new sharing technologies. So that cannot be overlooked. That is a really important foundational problem.
Yeah, I'll emphasize the funding. I forgot about that. We did have also a budget request in our FY21 budget for kind of the down payment on the IT modernization effort. And the FY22 budget's already in the works, so we're going to have to get support across the board. And so we'll be looking forward for everybody's support on that.
Well, funding is always key. I just want to thank both of you, Peter and Mary, for being part of this, and of course Kimberly and Jennifer, even though they're no longer with us. Thank you for participating on behalf of TIA. This has been a great discussion, and I'll hand it back now to the America Spectrum Management folks to see us closed.